Hello and welcome back to another codepro tutorial. So in today's lesson, we're going to learn how to fix the massive view controller. So I'm sure it's happened to you before. You've looked inside of a project and there's this view controller that's like 1,000 lines long and it's doing all this stuff and you're like, okay, well, what do I do with this and how do I navigate it? So what we're going to do is kind of take a look at a little smaller sample of that problem, but we're going to re-architect it together in a MVC or a model view controller fashion bit by bit until it's slimmed down enough where the view controller is doing what it's supposed to do, which is controlling views and not making network calls and parsing data and sorting data inside of a view controller. If you're a new iOS developer just getting started and all of this may seem a little scary to you, make sure you check out my iOS Development Fundamentals course, which is great for beginners. It'll teach you all the fundamental skills you need to know to become a great app developer. If you sign up using my links in the description, you will get the course for 50% off through Udemy, or you'll get 2 months of Skillshare Premium for free if you use the Skillshare link. So let's open up Xcode and get started. So before we start writing any code, let's take a look at a classic problem that you've probably run into, or even maybe do it yourself and don't even realize it, and that is the view controller that does way more things than it's supposed to. So this is in a Swift playground, and I just created a view controller that parses some data from a web service and then renders the results in a table view here. So it's just really simple. It's pulling back a list of JSON that looks like this with age and name, and that's it. So let's take a look at what's going on in this view controller to kind of see how can we fix this, how can we clean it up, how can we properly architect this in an MVC fashion or a model view controller fashion. So kind of as we analyze the code in here, we have a lot of things. We have a model of person, a person cell, we have loaded view, we have viewed load. Inside of viewed load, we're making a service call to get to make the web service call to fetch back the data, then we're parsing data, sorting data, and then ultimately displaying it. We have methods in here for sorting, we have fetching from the web service and generating data, so on and so forth. And then to top it all off, we have some table view delegate and data source methods here towards the bottom that are doing a lot of view related work inside of self-wrote index path. So this is pretty common. I've seen it myself. I've wrote it myself when I started off. And we're going to look at solutions for how we can break apart this view controller and move unrelated pieces of code, such as service calls, doing things to the view, sorting data, into their own separate locations so that it's not clunked up in one giant view controller. So I've started a brand new project here in Xcode, and what I'm going to do is, rather than write a lot of code here, I'm going to aim to analyze the playground that we started in part 1 and look at where we can extract a bit of code, move it over into this new project, but put it in the right place. That might mean we have to make a new file, a new grouping inside of the folder structure, but ultimately we're going to break apart this view controller until everything is properly architected in an MVC fashion. So you feel free to pause the video if you want to take a look at the code before we do anything. I'll kind of go section by section and try to go slowly. So if you want to jot anything down, you can, but really this is more about the principle of how to fix these kinds of patterns and problems rather than actually writing code itself. So let's start with the basics. So looking at our massive view controller from the playground, let's take a look at the M part for models, right? So we have this class stuffed in this view controller called person. And this is really something that we can separate out into its own file. And we can create a folder in our project here, and we'll call it models. So we'll do this. We'll do a new group. We'll call it models. And we'll create a person inside of it. So I'll do a new Swift file. And what I'll do here is cut and paste that person model from the playground into the person.swift file. And it's really simple. It's just contains properties, name and age, an initializer, and conforms to the codepro protocol so that we can parse JSON to it or map JSON to it. Now looking back over on our playground here, obviously this isn't going to compile anymore because we just removed the person class from the playground by cutting it into the other project. But let's continue on with what we were doing. So the next thing we run up against is this person cell, and it's just a UI table view cell, but it's living inside of the view controller, at least it's defined here. Now, I'm doing everything programmatically. You're probably using Interface Builder via Storyboard or through nibs, but that's fine. The same concept applies. What we can do is extract away this code from here, and we'll go back over to our project. And what I'll do here is we can create a new group. And what we can probably do is just call this views. And I'll create a new group under that, and we'll just call it cells. And inside of cells, we'll add a new Swift file. And I'm going to paste in the code that I had just copied over. And now my person cell lives inside of the person cell.swift file inside of the project. So now it's in its own file, it's out of the view controller, and it's more cleanly organized within the project itself. So let's go back over to the playground on the right-hand side here and see what else we can work with. So since I'm doing this programmatically, I'm going to have to go back into my view controller in my project and copy over a couple things from here. So I'm going to take the table view and take that and put it into my project over here as a property. And let's see here, I'm going to take my table data, I'm going to cut that and bring that over here, paste it in. And let's go back down through here. And you'll notice up top, we're conforming to UI table view delegate and UI table view data source. What we'll end up doing here is actually conforming to these through an extension. So what we can do here is going back to our view controller, we can create an extension. And it'll conform to the UI table view delegate protocol and the UI table view data source protocol. And what we can do is put the required methods inside of it, which is self-row at index path and number of rows and sections. So if we go scroll to the bottom of this playground file here where I had actually defined or implemented those methods, what I can do here is also the table view delegate method height for row at index path will return 125. We'll return table data.count. And self-row at index path, what I'm going to do for the moment is just return just something basic so I can re-architect everything else before we come back to actually fixing this. Actually, that's wrong. TableView.dq. Yeah, that's what I want. Okay, so now we can group associated functionality that belongs with the table view inside of its own extension. So it's not littered inside of the view controller. We can keep so some of the view management logic separate from the conforming protocols for table view delegate and data source. And if we wanted to really get fancy, we could move these to separate files. We could actually have a separate file for the UI table view delegate conformance and for the data source so that they're completely separate and even out of this file entirely. But I'm not going to do that just because it's going a little too much. I think this is good for now for organizing things. So let's move on with this and see what else we can clean up here. So looking back in view did load, let's take a look at the next chunk. So configure table view. Let's see what it does. And what we can do to clean it up. Now, inside of my playground for this method in particular, it would programmatically create the table view, set the style, add the constraints programmatically, and then add it to the view as a subview, and then register the cell that's going to work with that table view. And we can do all of that in our view controller, that's fine. So what we'll do here is keep this pretty much as is. We'll copy that chunk of code, and if you want to copy it, feel free to pause and you can copy down what we have here. But we'll copy that and paste that back over into the project here. So going back to inside of the view controller, we'll paste configure table view. And let me just drag this out here so it's a little more readable. The other thing I'll do here is we'll call it here. And I think after we go ahead and configure this, what we can do is just do .tableview.delegate equals self, and then self.tableview.data source equals self. And we can kind of handle all of that in here. So that's gonna be fine. That'll hook up our methods down here to respond to our data when we load it in there. Now let's move on with the next step in this refactor. So the next big part in the playground is the fetch data from web service. So let's just take a look at what this method does and see if we can come up with any ideas for how to clean this up. So it's pretty simple. This method is taking a URL, it's making a network request to the web service that I had set up, and I'm just running something off of localhost. It's really not relevant, it's just I needed something in here so that we could go and refactor, and it passes back the resulting data through the completion handlers here if it fails, and here if it succeeds. So what do we want to do here? You know, obviously this is in the view controller. It doesn't belong here. What if we want to reuse this in other parts of our application? You know, we don't want to copy paste this method from this view controller in another view controller. What we really want to do is create some kind of a service class that we can basically put this code in and reuse anywhere that it's needed. So the simplest way we can go about doing something like that is creating a designated class that's responsible for all network-related things, like our API client, our network client, or whatever you want to call it, web service client. So let's go back into our actual project here, and we'll create a new group. We'll call it networking. So going back into this networking group here, I'm going to create a new file. And I'm just going to call my file web service client. But you can name yours whatever you wish. And inside of here, what I'm going to do is extract out this fetch data from web service method and paste it inside of this file. But I'm going to create a new class. So I'll call this class web service client. And we'll give it that method here. We'll make it internal just by not specifying anything. And we'll give it that one method to fetch data from web service, given a URL, calls back on a completion handler. It's just plain data. There's nothing in here that is specific to the app. It could be reused anywhere. So that'll satisfy that condition right there. Now back inside of our actual project here, let's go into our view controller. And we're going to create a property up at the top, private let web service client equals web service client. So we'll keep a reference to it on the view controller. Now, in a different situation, and we still could do it, but it would require a little more work in this tutorial. Rather than keep it as a property on the view controller, it would be better to inject the client into the view controller, to pass the dependency in through an initializer. And we could totally and absolutely do that, but I'm just trying to keep things simple here. So any other classes or services that you're making that might have a dependency on the web service client, it's a good practice to inject it in through a constructor via constructor injection so that dependencies can be passed around rather than holding strong references to them inside of a class such as a view controller. But I'm just trying to keep this simple because there's a lot of parts here that we're having to refactor and decompose. So let's move on now with the actual service call that gets made inside of the viewDidLoad. So back over on the playground side here where we have our viewDidLoad, I'm looking at the service URL and the fetch here. So what I'm going to do is copy this whole block for now, and I'm going to go back over into the project and paste that in right at the bottom of viewDidLoad. I'm going to delete everything inside of here for right now with the exception of, we'll come back to that because we're going to fix a couple things. Now, let's delete this comment. Now, again, remember, we put this in our web service client, so we need to do web service client dot fetch data from web service for URL. And you can see here that it's green again, so this is going to run. So the next step in this refactor is looking at what happens next. So obviously when our network call finishes, it's just giving us back some data and any kind of service error if something blew up. So inside of our success path is going to be inside this else block here. We need to basically parse this data or map this data so that it can be associated with an array of people. Now, again, this is a situation where parsing code or anything related to parsing a service call doesn't belong in a view controller. It should be in a separate class. So it can be in another service, a manager, something that is responsible for parsing the data that comes back from a web service and then giving you back the model objects that have been parsed. Now, I could put it inside of the web service client, but I'm going to choose to keep them separate for now. So what I'm going to do is create a separate class that is solely responsible for parsing the data that comes back from the service call and provides the models back that we can plug right in to our table data. So back over in the playground here, if we scroll down a little bit below the service call, we have a method here that takes that data and then constructs the table data from the service data. And so we want to move this outside of the view controller, and it really belongs in its own class or altogether or out of the view controller. So what we'll do is copy that function generate table data. We'll go back over to our project. What I'm going to do is create a new class under networking here under our folder. We'll just generate a new file. I'm going to call this service response mapper and create. And we'll go ahead and define the class. And paste in the method that we had copied over. And we'll remove the private access. We'll make it internal by just leaving it as is. And if we look at this, this name doesn't really make sense anymore because it's not in the context of a view controller. So we really want to come up with a better name for what this method does relative to the class that it's in. So what we could say here is map data, and then from service response. And we can go ahead and construct, we construct our decoder. We decode the JSON from the service response into an array of person objects, and ultimately we return the mapped collection. So we map data from service response. So now that our mapper has been defined, if we go back into our view controller and we want to go ahead and map the data that comes back from the service response, we can go ahead and do that. So what I'll do here is give this a better name. Instead of people data, let's just call it service response data. And we'll go ahead and put back our guardlet check. So I'm going to go back into the playground here and just copy this guardlet here. We'll just paste that back, but we'll update the name. So service response data should not be nil. And then what we'll do here is let people equals the service response mapper dot map data from service response data. Actually, I gotta use the name there. And so we have now our people, and they're fully mapped, and we can plug them right into the table data and reload the table. So, and we need to call this with try and wrap it in a do catch because it can throw an error. So let me go ahead and do that real fast. Throw in the catch, and we'll do the do block or the try block inside the do block there. And now at this point we can update our table data. So what we can do here is self.tableData equals people, and we'll just reload the data on the table view and call it an exception. Now there's one other part we need to do here, and that's our sorting. So following a similar convention, what we'll do here is take a look at our playground and see what's left that needs to be cleaned up. So obviously we have the sort by name and sort by age. So we want to put these in pretty much a different place altogether. So what we can do is copy these two functions, and we can go back over into our project here, and we'll create a new folder, new group. We'll just call it utility. And we'll put a new file inside of it. And we'll just call this person utility for now, just for lack of a better name. And what we can do in here is class person utility. We can paste those functions in. And really, we don't need an instance of this class, so we could arguably make these just static functions. And actually, the same could probably be said about the mapper. There's no reason we need to have an instance of that, even though I declared an instance of that and held a property to it. But I mean, obviously, we could expand that mapper and do more things with it, so it could also be static if we wanted it to be so. But for this example, we'll just keep a static functions in our person utility class here. And we'll go back. And what we'll do then is person utility make sure Xcode can find it, dot sort by age, people, and we'll do let self.tableData equals the return value or the sorted people by age that comes back. And so let's go ahead and build that. Build succeeded. So now we have eliminated two more methods that were living on our view controller, and now they can be used in a utility class anywhere else that they might be needed throughout our app as our code base continues to grow. So let's look at what's currently outstanding. We've cleaned up what seems to be just about everything, but there's one other spot we need to look at, and that is down here in the table view cell for row at index path. Now you'll notice that there's a lot of stuff going on in here. There is a lot of UI stuff, such as setting background colors, setting font and border width and border color, and none of this stuff needs to exist in the view controller. This is code that's purely operating on the view. It can live inside of the view itself. It's styling the particular cell, and so what we can do is we can extract this out. We can create an additional method on the person cell, and actually we can even handle it in the initializer for styling the view elements, and that's what we'll go ahead and do next. So what I'll do is copy all of this UI styling code, and we'll go ahead and leave the code that's assigning the text label here. But what we'll do is go back over to our actual project, so I'll just put the playground on the side, and we'll go to the person cell. And so I have inside of here an initializer with the reuse identifier and the style. Now granted, I'm doing everything programmatically. If you were doing this through a nib, you would have the awake from nib as an opportunity. You could, if you wanted to, you could write a method in here that you expose publicly, but I'm going to handle everything inside of the initializer for this example. So what I'll do here is create a private function just called style cell. I'm going to paste in the styling code that we copied over from the playground. Now, since I'm inside of the cell here, I simply just need to call text label. I can remove all that person cell dot convention because we were inside of the cell itself. So this is just accessing the properties on the instance of this cell directly. So I'll go ahead and build it. And build succeeded. And so now what will happen is in our initializer, we'll call style cell as an additional step, and that'll happen automatically. And now for the final step is just grabbing the cell from the playground here. So what we'll do is just update our code here that does the getting the person cell and assigning the model or assigning the label to it. So what I'll do is copy that whole block again, go back over to our project and to our self-road index path here. What we'll do is just delete this UI code that we already moved into our style method and just reduce that down to this. And what we can do here, so what we're doing here is we're getting the person cell, which is the custom table cell that we have, and we are getting the model at the corresponding row, assigning the text, and returning the cell back. So at this step we're done. I'm going to go ahead and run everything we have right now in the simulator and just compare the results with what we saw in the playground. It looks like everything here is looking correct. We have the people coming back from the service response. We have sorted by age, so 9, 19, 20, 29, up to 75. Everything looks good. Now, if we look at what we have side by side, now I've gone ahead and restored the playgrounds back to the original code that was there before we started removing things. And we just kind of take a look here at what we've got. So you can see my view controller on our project has about 95-ish lines of code, and going down to the playground here kind of ends at 165. So we took, and we didn't eliminate code, we simply reorganized code into more meaningful places. So now if we go back and look at our overall structure of our project, we can see that it's a little bit more intelligently designed. We have utility, an opportunity to add utility classes, a networking folder for any API web service related stuff can live in here. Any additional views that we make can go inside of the views folder. Different cells can go in the cells folder. Additional model classes that we make can go in the models folder. And one final point before we finish. So design patterns are really kind of not black and white. There's a lot of gray area in the sense of maybe how you name things, how you use certain conventions and patterns within your own code, within your implementation. So while you may not necessarily agree with some of the decisions and namings that I did for this example, there's really no debating the fact that now we have a much better structured project than we did before when we had everything living in one giant view controller. And so as you go forward with learning different kinds of design patterns and where you can use them and how they add value to your code, you can really get a feel for how to architect an entire app, how to structure everything from the networking layer all the way down to the view presentation and everything in between. And there's a lot of different design patterns out there. This is just a play on MVC, Model View Controller, but you have Viper, you have MVVM, and you have all kinds of other smaller patterns that are used in between, kind of in conjunction with some of the larger patterns that are available for use in iOS. So that's just something to keep in mind as you continue forward in iOS development. And that wraps up this tutorial. So now when you see a massive view controller, you'll hopefully be able to deconstruct it into the associated parts and put those in the right places. And when you're writing new code, you'll get an idea for, okay, we're going to create a service for this because all of this functionality belongs in one class. It doesn't belong in a view controller. So you can start to architect your code better going forward, and that's the whole point, kind of eliminating tech debt and not getting into bad practices along the way. So if you found this tutorial helpful, let me know. Go ahead and smash that like button and consider subscribing to CodePro to stay up to date for all the latest tutorials on this channel. Make sure to follow me on Patreon. You can find my link down below in the description. I will be posting new content there that'll be exclusive for patrons only. Make sure you follow me on Facebook and on Twitter, and let me know in the comment section down below what tutorial you guys would like to see next. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll catch you in the next one.